Chapter 3. Later, Rebecca laid in the dark, cocooned in the soft warm bed, unable to sleep. Her mind was spinning too swiftly to allow rest. She'd relaxed her guard enough to listen to what her instinct was telling her. In doing so, she'd not only sensed that she could trust this man, but also that if she wanted, he could be her mate. But was he willing? Was she his potential mate too? Mating and marriage aren't certain things, even among the kitsune. The mating instinct helps, but it doesn't guarantee happiness. A true mating happens only when two or more people find someone that they can make a life with. When that is possible, the instinct will be there for all involved. But that's not always the case. Sometimes the instinct only surfaces in one of the potential pair. The upside is you can have more than one potential mate. You're not stuck with the first you encounter. Chances are, if you keep looking, you'll find someone who you can make a life with. Granted, some choose to marry non-mates. Actually, in the Chanat Rebecca grew up in, marrying without mating was common, but she knew it wasn't that way in other groups. Lying in bed, she couldn't stop herself from thinking back to the kiss she and Nick had shared. He was interested, even if she wasn't his potential mate. She wondered if he would be more interested in protecting her, if she was sleeping with him. She couldn't lie still any longer. She kicked off the blankets and sat up, sliding her legs off the edge of the bed. She reached and pulled the sweatshirt she'd taken off before getting into bed from the chair next to the bed. After living in nothing but her cougar skin for so long, she had a hard time wearing anything, especially anything so heavy, to bed. She pulled the large sweatshirt over her head, letting it fall to mid-thigh. Thinking no one else was awake, she decided she'd be okay with just the sweatshirt. After quietly opening the bedroom door, Rebecca tiptoed down the hall, careful not to make any noise and wake her host. With her enhanced night vision, even in human form, she didn't need to turn on a light. The moon outside gave off enough light that she had no trouble seeing where she was going as she made her way to the kitchen. She went to the refrigerator. Opening it, she peered inside, looking for milk or something else that might calm her enough to sleep. Nick had told her earlier in the evening to make herself at home, so she didn't feel guilty for snooping. She grabbed the jug of milk and set it on the counter next to the fridge. She glanced around the room, trying to decide the most likely cabinet to find a glass in when she saw him. His presence startled her, and she let out a small scream as she dropped into a crouch. It was a position she could defend herself from if she were attacked. After a few seconds, her panic subsided enough for her to realize it wasn't a stranger in the room, it was Nick. Standing quietly in the corner near a large window, he watched her in silence. She stood upright, taking a deep breath and letting it out in a rush, trying to blow some of the tension from her body. "You startled me." She shrugged. "I didn't expect to find anyone sitting in the dark, much less you. I couldn't sleep, so I came in here to think. I can stand here in the dark that's not really dark, watch the world out the window and lose myself in thought. If it's any consolation, you surprised me too. I didn't realize you'd come into the room until you opened the fridge. I was trying not to wake you. You having trouble sleeping too?" He changed the subject. He couldn't stop his eyes from drifting over her body, noticing the bare, shapely legs stretching below the hem of the faded gray sweatshirt. That shirt never looked anywhere near that good on me, he thought. It took all his self-control to stay where he was. "Glasses?" she asked, drawing his attention back to what she was doing. "There." He pointed to a cabinet on the other end of the room. He watched as she reached up to open the cabinet and retrieved a glass. The hem of the sweatshirt hitched up, exposing a long line of creamy thigh as it rose. He felt his cock stiffen in response. He looked away quickly before she turned around and caught him staring. Rebecca carried her glass back to the milk jug and poured herself some, before putting the half-full jug back into the fridge. She picked up her drink and approached Nick. Sipping slowly from the glass, she moved across the room, stalking her way toward him. Rebecca decided then and there to take the situation into her own hands. She hadn't expected to run into him tonight, but she'd take advantage of it just the same. She was going to seduce him. If nothing else, he'd be more protective of a lover than a stranger. She sipped the milk she'd poured herself while trying to gauge his response. She lowered her lids and looked him up and down, hoping the sultry bedroom eyes would entice him. She could tell he was interested, the bulge in the front of his jeans gave that much away. But was he interested enough? She took the last sip of milk from the glass and set it on table as she passed, continuing her slow advance. She could see him watching her, his eyes glued to her as she approached. "I've been thinking." Her voice was low and breathy. He had to swallow before he could speak. "What have you been thinking?" "I've been thinking," she repeated, "that maybe I was a little hasty when I pulled away earlier." Rebecca stopped in front of him, her body almost against his. She let him feel the brush of her breast against his bare chest as she lifted both arms up and pulled his head down until his mouth met hers. Rebecca opened her mouth against his, running her tongue along the outline of his lips until he opened to her. She swept her tongue inside his mouth to mate with his, tasting him again. Nick couldn't resist, she felt so good against him. He reached down, intent on lifting her closer against him. He felt his whole body stiffen and go on alert when his hands, expecting to meet cloth, encountered only the soft skin of her ass. He ran his hands over her, reveling in the soft silken texture of her skin, before he cupped her cheeks and lifted her tightly against him. He felt the heat of her body through his jeans, where they pressed against his now straining erection. He wanted no doubt left in her mind about how she made him feel. He set her onto her feet once more, so he could slide his hands up the sides of her body, under the fabric of the sweatshirt to cup and knead her full breasts. Rebecca continued kissing him deeply, lost in the feeling of his skin against hers. The strength he'd shown when he'd easily lifted her only made her more eager. He ran his hands up her stomach and over her breasts, she moaned into his mouth, encouraging him to continue. He flicked his thumbs back and forth over her tight nipples while gripping the flesh of her breasts. She buried her fingers deep in his hair, holding his mouth against hers, as she poured all the urgency she was feeling into the kiss. Nick broke the kiss, speaking against her mouth. "Are you sure?" His voice ragged. "More," she moaned breathlessly. He accepted the answer and her seduction, as he again lowered his mouth to hers again. He moved his hands, abandoning her breasts and sliding them down her stomach once more and around her hips. He cupped her butt and lifted her again, higher this time. He pulled her tight against him, carrying her, as he stepped away from the wall. "Wrap your legs around me." He broke the kiss again, as she pulled her hands from his hair in order to hang on as he moved. He slid his mouth to the side of her neck, where he could kiss and caress her but still see where he was going. He didn't want to hurt her by walking into a wall or something else. He carried her through the house and into his bedroom, not bothering to switch on the light, as he set her down on the bed. He pulled, taking the sweatshirt off over her head as he stood. Rebecca sat on the bed where he'd set her, raised her arms to let the shirt slip off, but once clear, she only lowered her hands as far as his body. She slid them over the skin of his chest and stomach, marveling at the texture of his skin and hair, and the warmth of his skin. Nick pushed her back until she lay on the bed, and leaned his body over hers. He bent to kiss her again, briefly, before moving away. He kissed, licked and nipped his way down her body. He paused when he reached her full breasts, pulling one erect nipple into his mouth, suckling and biting gently at the taut flesh. With one hand he cupped the other breast, softly pinching and pulling at the nipple as he kneaded the pliant flesh. Rebecca's sighs and soft moans letting him know he wasn't being too rough, while her hand in his hair pulling him closer told him she wanted more. Nick moved his mouth to the other breast, trailing his hand down her stomach. He smoothed his fingers over her hip and down the outside of her leg. When he reached her knee, he lifted, pulling her leg around his body while sliding his hand up the back of her leg and pulling her tight up against his body. He felt the heat of her desire where his hips rested against hers. Rebecca pulled her hands from Nick's hair and flattened them against the tops of his shoulders, flexing her fingers until they dug into the muscles there. When she realized what she was doing, she was afraid she would claw him with her nails and hurt him, so she moved her hands away, fisting them in the smooth bedspread beneath her. Nick continued moving down her body, kissing and licking his way past her stomach, until he settled between her thighs. "Do you want this, kitten?" he asked softly, looking up her body into her face. "Don't stop," Rebecca cried, picking up her head to look down at him. She was unable to stop her hips from rising, silently begging for his attention. Nick bent down and ran the flat of his tongue over the closed, puffy lips of her sex. Rebecca gasped, her hips lifted again, restless for more. He licked again, deeper, opening the lips of her vulva with his tongue, tasting the cream that she was dripping with her desire of him. When his tongue reached the small nub near the top, he circled it with his tongue, teasing her briefly before putting his mouth over it and sucked for a moment. He scraped his teeth gently across the small button as he released it. Nick shifted until both of Rebecca's legs lay draped over his shoulders. He slid his hands under her butt and lifted her slightly, angling her hips as he moved his mouth over her again. He ran his tongue around the edges of her opening, savoring the cream waiting there for him. Rebecca quivered with need. She ached for him to fill her. "Nick," she gasped, unable to keep her body from squirming. "More." He plunged his tongue deep inside her over and over, fucking her with his mouth, pulling more of the sweet cream from her. He licked the length of her slit once more before settling his mouth over and working his tongue over her clit. He slid one finger deep inside her, moving it in and out of her clenching heat. She was close, he knew. He added a second finger to the first and scraped his teeth against the hard button at the top of her slit, then licked it soothingly for a moment. Suddenly, he gently bit down, sending her exploding over the edge into an orgasm that left her gasping as her heat clamped repeatedly on his fingers. He ran his tongue her clit once more, soothing the sting from his bite, before he lowered his mouth and drank in the cream flowing from her core. As Rebecca started to calm from the orgasm, he moved his body up, kissing his way up her body again. He ran his tongue over her sensitized skin, feeling the shivers advancing over her skin. He kissed and nibbled the undersides of her breasts before advancing to the tightly puckered nipples. He took each nipple into his mouth in turn, sucking hard, while flicking or gently biting the sensitive tips. In no time, Rebecca was once again moaning and restless in his arms, and by the time he continued up her body, taking small gentle bites of skin along her shoulder and up her neck, she was eager to kiss him again, to taste herself on his lips. Nick kissed her deeply, aggressively. He held her mouth captive as he lined his erect cock up with her hot, wet opening. He pushed gently, working his way in carefully. When he had just the tip snug inside her, he stilled, reaching for her hands. When his hands found hers, he patiently untangled them from the bedding beneath her and entwined his fingers with hers, bringing them over her head and pinning them there. His mouth still covering hers, his tongue dancing with hers, he thrust hard, burying himself deep inside her in a single push. She broke away from the kiss, throwing her head back with a gasp. "Did I hurt you?" Nick asked, immediately concerned. He released her hands and caressed her jaw with one hand. "No," she gasped, barely able to breathe. "So good. More." The last word came out in more of a moan than anything else. He moved again, slowly withdrawing. "You like that?" He reversed direction and pushing slowly into her again. She could only nod, still struggling to find enough breath to speak. She once again wrapped her arms around his body, digging her fingers into the muscles on his back as he increased the tempo of his movements. She felt his muscles flexing under his skin as he thrust in and out of her body. Her body arched, her fingers and toes curling as he pushed her closer to that edge again. That edge where there was nothing but sensation, the feeling of him buried inside her, filling her. Nick lowered his head, putting his lips to her neck. The temptation to bite her, to pierce her skin, was hard to resist. He wouldn't do that, not without her consent. Instead he kissed her, running his tongue over the soft skin. He thrust deep into her, pushing her closer. He cupped one breast, flicking his thumb over the taut peak. He could tell she was close. He pushed her further, sliding his hand between them and pressing his thumb over her clit. She exploded, clenching around him time and again. He felt her teeth against his shoulder as she bit down there, and he couldn't hold out any longer. He groaned her name as he exploded deep inside her. "Kitten," Nick whispered. "You've got to let go." He held as still as he could. If she hadn't already broken the skin, he didn't want to do it accidentally. He felt the grip of her teeth loosen. When she'd released him, he rolled off her, not wanting to crush her with his weight. He tried to look at the bite on his shoulder, but he couldn't see it well enough to tell anything. He reached over to the table beside the bed and switched on the light. They both shielded their eyes for a few seconds, until the bright light no longer stung. "Kitten, I need you to look at this for me." He turned so she could see the bite mark. "Did you break the skin?" It took Rebecca a few seconds to realize what he was asking. She looked at the mark she had given him. "It's bruised but the skin's not broken." She reached up and ran her fingertips softly over the mark. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hurt you. Something came over me, and I couldn't resist." "It's all right, kitten. I wanted to do the same to you, but I didn't want to force you." "What do you mean, force me?" she asked, confused. "Has no one explained mating to you?" Nick was taken aback. "I know about mating. It's the sensation that tells you when someone could be your mate," she replied. "What about how a mating is confirmed, sealed in place?" he prompted. Rebecca could only blink at him, having never heard of such a thing. "You've never been told how to seal a mating?" he asked. She shook her head. Nick lay on his back before reaching over and pulling her close. She lay along his side as he pulled the blankets up over them. "Here, let's get comfortable and I'll explain it." He wrapped one arm around her as she snuggled against his side, laying her head on his shoulder. "You good?" He knew he was delaying the inevitable. Rebecca bent one leg over his and curled an arm over his chest before nodding against his shoulder. "Sealing a mating is very simple, kitten. A piercing bite during orgasm ties the bitten to the biter for the rest of their life." He put it as simply as he could. Then he lay quietly, holding her while the implications of the information sunk in, and the questions he knew would come started. "Ties how? What does sealing a mating mean exactly?" "When done properly and both parties are sealed, it means that their lives are tied together irrevocably. They're bonded, physically and psychically. Mates always know when the other is injured, and just the nearness of a mate can speed healing. Sometimes it can give the couple extra powers, telepathy, sharing energy, that kind of thing, but only between each other." "Wow." Rebecca was silent for a moment. "So what you're telling me is that if I'd broken the skin when I bit you, I would be mated to you for the rest of my life?" She wanted to make sure she had it straight. "No, I would have been mated to you. You would be free to do as you please." Nick took a deep breath and let it out slowly. It has to go both ways for it to be a true, sealed mating. "I don't get it." She was confused. "You said a bite that breaks the skin during sex will seal the bitten to the other? If that's true, then why don't the non-mated couples in my old Chanat seal themselves to each other?" "That's not quite all there is to it. There are several elements required for it to work. First, the bitten must be a potential mate. If they aren't, then their body won't accept the hormone that seals the mating. Second, the biter must be a potential mate, or the hormone isn't released. Third, the hormone is only released during orgasm. Biting at any other time during sex, or with someone not potentially your mate, while erotic, is harmless. So what you're saying is I'm potentially your mate? She was catching on. You are, he confirmed. I'm pretty sure I'm potentially yours as well. Then why didn't you want? For some reason the thought that he didn't want to be her mate hurt. Hold on a second there, kitten. He squeezed her tighter to his side with the arm she lay on, cutting her off mid-sentence. It's not that I don't want you. I think I've already proven otherwise. He chuckled. I already told you, I didn't want to force you. You're already on the run from someone trying to force you into marriage. I don't want to give you the same reason to run from me. Besides, I want you to choose me, not get stuck with me. Rebecca didn't know what to say to that, so she kept silent, hugging as she held back her tears. She wasn't even sure why she was crying. Get some rest. Nick softly kissed the top of her head. We can talk about it more in the morning, if you want. Nick held her close, enjoying the feeling of her next to him. He lay awake listening to her breathe, long after she fell asleep. He knew he could easily love her, and he wasn't sure what he'd do if she decided to leave. He hoped he didn't have to find out.